Hello, I'm Chris Alvarez, and welcome to Military History Inside Out, brought to you by War Scholar. We talk about military history from ancient to modern times and everything in between. You can find more podcast episodes, written interviews, word games, and the most detailed military history timeline on the web at warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. We're on YouTube at warscholar1945. You can send comments and suggestions to info@warscholar.org. Thanks for listening. I'm speaking with Sir Max Hastings, author of Operation Chastise, the RAF's most brilliant attack of World War II. Thank you for speaking with me.
My pleasure, Chris.
So first, I know you've written a lot of military history, a lot of books, and we've actually talked about your Vietnam book previously. Has this book always been on your mind to write on this subject, or did something more recently prompt your interest?
Well, there were two things. First of all, the story of Operation Chastise, which was the May 1943 RAF 617 Squadron's attack on Germany's Ruhr dams. This was part of the legends of my childhood, that although the raid happened 2 years before I was born, that Paul Brickhill wrote a book about it in 1951, and then 4 years later they made one of the classic British black and white war movies of all time, starring Richard Todd and Redgrave playing the scientist who devised the so-called bouncing bombs, Barnes Wallis. And so these stories were what I grew up with when I was a kid, and I'd always wanted to write something about it, and I was never convinced that any of the books that had been written really got to the bottom of the story. Partly, in the days when the books were written in the 1950s about it, everybody still took an incredibly nationalistic view about the Second World War. And one of the reasons we all thought the dams raid was terrific by comparison with the raids that burnt Germany's cities was that it seemed victimless, that nobody seemed to have got hurt. It was a huge achievement by these incredibly brave 133 young men of 617 Squadron, in which no people got hurt, just these dams got broken. But I was always very aware of the fact that not only German civilians, so first of all, 1,300 or 1,400 people died in these attacks, most of whom were not just German civilians. They were Hitler's prisoners. They were slave laborers. They were over 700 Polish and Russian and Ukrainian women who were held in a camp below the Mona, drowned in what the Germans today call the Mona catastrophe, the great flood, the biblical torrent that followed the breaking of the Mona Dam.
At the time, did the British public, were they aware of any of these casualties? Or actually the British government, did the Soviets lodge any kind of complaint? Did the Germans make any big deal about these prisoner casualties?
The Germans did. The Germans obviously wanted to suggest that this was an atrocity, and so they made big play with the civilian casualties. But at the time, that by 1943, the war had been going on for nearly 4 years, and all people knew that the British public was pretty dispirited by the summer of 1943, that not much seemed to be going right in the war effort. Sure, once the United States and Russia were in the war, it was obvious that sooner or later the Allies were going to win. But in 1943, that an awful lot was still going wrong, and the British Army was still suffering quite severe defeats sometimes, although the whole sort of trend of the war was working for the Allies, that an awful lot of pain was being suffered, an awful lot of blood was being shed. And so the British people didn't feel too good at that point. And it was wonderful for them to feel that at last here was a great triumph of British arms, and they all woke up the morning after the dams raid. They saw all these huge front-page aerial photographs of the flooding of the Ruhr. And they thought, this is terrific, at last we've done something right. And also, although they weren't told at the time about these amazing bouncing bombs, so-called, that were devised by the scientist Barnes Wallis, that they did realize that for the 19 crews of the so-called Dambusters squadron, who attacked these dams, flying straight and level at a height of 60 feet, just 60 feet above the water, flying dead low to drop these bouncing bombs, which broke these dams. And it was a mixture of courage and British ingenuity that really cheered up the British people and impressed the people of the United States. That one always has to remember, Churchill and Roosevelt talked a lot of baloney during the war. They had to, about the Grand Alliance. But the American public, as all the opinion polls show, they thought pretty poorly of the British. All they could see about the British was the British always wanted things from the Americans. The British Army kept getting beat. And suddenly, they too woke up the morning after the Dams raid, and they saw these incredible photographs. And the New York Times carried an editorial saying, this is the most amazing feat by the British since the Battle of Britain. And American people really were impressed. They really thought, here is something amazing that the British have really got right. And it's very striking that right through to the end of the war, although Americans had respect for the Royal Navy, they never thought much of the British Army, but they thought that the Royal Air Force was absolutely terrific. And one of the reasons they thought the Royal Air Force was terrific, part of it was the Battle of Britain in 1940, but part of it was raids like the Dambusters raid, the Operation Chastise, and it was an amazing achievement. The bad news, from the British point of view, the British hoped that breaking these dams in the Ruhr were going to cut off water to Ruhr industry, because to make steel, to run the coal mines, to run almost anything to do with industry, you need an awful lot of water. And these dams were the dams that provided the water for German industry. Unfortunately, before the raid, a spoilsport economist in the British Ministry of Economic Warfare, he warned that although the Mona Dam was a vital target, the Mona Reservoir provided a lot of the water, there was another dam 8 miles down the road called the Sorpe, which he said, if you only break the Mona and you don't break the Sorpe, then the Germans are still going to have enough water for their industry. And the Sorpe Dam, unfortunately for the British, was an earthen dam. It had a huge earthen wall, and it was not vulnerable to Barnes-Wallis's terrific bouncing bombs. They were really actually depth charges. They were 3-ton depth charges they were dropping. And this huge earth wall of the Sorpe, it had a sloping face. And these depth charges, they codenamed them upkeeps. These upkeeps had very little hope of breaking an earthen dam. And the Ministry of Economic Warfare, they warned beforehand, if you can't break this dam, they didn't quite say you're wasting your time, but they said there's no doubt that breaking the Mona will make a fantastic mess, releasing whatever it was, 150 million tons of water on the countryside around. But it will not much hurt Ruhr industry, and that's actually what happened. So the economic effect on the Germans was pretty limited, but it was an incredibly spectacular achievement, and it made everybody feel better. And in wars, and especially in the Second World War, the moral business, what it does to morale, first of all, it cheered up the British and the Americans, but it really, really, really scared the Germans. Even Hitler and Goebbels were incredibly upset. They were really alarmed. And Speer, Hitler's armaments chief, he woke up in the middle of the night to be told about this, and he overflew the floods first thing next morning at dawn, and then he landed. And at first, he was absolutely terrified that this was going to have a hell of an impact on German industry. But then Speer, who was a genius of improvisation and management, Speer got his workforce together. He brought in thousands of workmen, a lot of them Dutch, Italian, French, forced labor. He brought them down to the Mona, he got them working. And by mid-September 1943, 6 months after the dams were broken, just in time to catch the autumn rains of 1943, they managed to repair the dams, and the Mona Reservoir filled again that winter. And the big British mistake, what they should have done, was to bomb the repairs, not with the depth charges, not with upkeeps, as they call them, but with ordinary conventional bombs, because they had this huge cat's cradle of scaffolding, wooden scaffolding, up against the dams. And you wouldn't have needed very accurate bombing to play hell with the repairs. But the British didn't do this because the commander-in-chief of Bomber Command, a monster called Sir Arthur Harris. Harris never really believed in attacking the dams anyway. And once Chastise had happened and everybody had had their day in the headlines, all he wanted to do was forget about the dams. And it was a huge mistake. And I was lucky enough to interview both Harris and Barnes Wallis, the bomb's creator, back in 1977 when I was writing another book called Bomber Command. And Wallis said to me then that the great disaster had been after the success of the original attack that they didn't bomb the repairs, and that's because Harris didn't want any part of it. And Wallis was still pretty bitter about that all those years later, because Wallis had always had a conscience about the very heavy losses 617 Squadron suffered, because they lost 8 out of the 19 crews that were sent to the dams. That's a loss rate of the crews that actually got to Germany. They lost almost half, which was pretty heavy even by the standard of wartime bomber losses. So Wallis felt pretty bad about that. And he also felt bad because he was a very serious Christian, and he was appalled by the civilian casualties, which he hadn't even thought about before the raid was launched. So he felt that the sacrifice of these incredibly brave young men was wasted by the fact that they didn't bomb the repairs.
I'm speaking with Sir Max Hastings, author of Operation Chastise, the RAF's most brilliant attack of World War II, coming out in the U.S. on February 18th, 2020, from Harper Books. You can find his work at maxhastings.com. The link is also in the show notes. And don't forget to like and follow me at warscholar.org and warscholar1945 on YouTube. Now back to our podcast. So this brings to mind one question I had was this concept of Churchill's concept of military theater. And what you've described to me sort of suggests that the whole operation was about the theatrical part and morale, and then beyond that, they didn't push.
Yeah, I'm glad you reminded me of that, because one of the points I've made, not only in this book, but in other books I've written about the Second World War, is that Churchill always understood, in many ways better than his own military commanders, that when you had this long lag between Dunkirk, when the British Army was kicked out of France, and D-Day in 1944, that's 4 years before the British and American armies did anything big, because Italy and North Africa were not big operations by the standards. They just involved a handful of divisions by comparison with what was going on in Russia, where you've got millions of men confronting each other every day. So Churchill realized that if you did nothing for 4 years, you had to try and persuade people. You had to do things that made people believe there was still some momentum in the war. And very often, operations would be devised, which the chiefs of staff would think were a waste of time, some of his commando raids on northern France and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But Churchill regarded, and I created this name, military theatre, Churchill realized that you had to do things that cheered up the British and American peoples and made them feel that something was actually going on with the war, even if in truth, in the sort of big, harsh numbers, not a lot was going on. So Churchill realized that the dams raid was enormously valuable, and he was actually in Washington at the time that the dams raid took place. And it was a great moment when he and the head of the RAF got the signal in Washington saying that this raid had been successful, because, my gosh, they needed some evidence for the American chiefs of staff, as well as the American people, that the British were out there actually doing something, because it was an embarrassing reality that more than half the entire British Army was sitting in Britain training and getting equipped between June 1940 and June 1944, which was an awful long lag.
Mm-hmm. Now, I noticed there was an American that was part of this crew. He was with the RAF, but was that part of the theater bit, that an American was part of this operation?
No, I don't think. He was a remarkable man called Joe McCarthy, mm-hmm. who before the war had been a Coney Island lifesaver. And he'd always wanted, he came from a very humble New York background. I think his father was a fireman. And he'd always wanted to fly. But the United States Air Force wouldn't have him because he hadn't completed high school. So he rode a bus up to the Canadian border, and he joined the Canadian Air Force, and then eventually ended up in the Royal Air Force. And he very quickly proved himself to be an outstanding pilot. And a lot of the people who joined the 617 Squadron, there was an elite, there was a core, a sort of tight-knit core of people whom Guy Gibson, the squadron commander, knew well. And he'd heard about Joe McCarthy, and he knew that McCarthy was an outstanding bomber pilot, so he requested him. So they didn't choose him because he was American. They chose him because he was a very good pilot. Now, McCarthy, I think he got much less credit than he deserved for his part in the raid, because he was one of 6 crews that were dispatched to attack the Sorpy Dam, this vital second dam, the earthen dam. And they couldn't bounce their bombs across the water. They had to drop theirs flying along the dam wall and just drop it as close as they could to the dam wall. But it was a very difficult, even to do it with conventional bombing, because the dam lay in a valley, and you had to make this very low approach, practically touching the church tower of the village, and fly along the wall, and then pull up like mad after you drop the bomb, not to crash into the hillside, into the forest on the hill. So McCarthy gets the Sorpy down, and he was the only one of the designated crews who survived that long, because they'd all flown very low over Germany, and most of the rest of them were shot down or had to turn back. So McCarthy gets the Sorpy, and he, like many of those young men, he was so dedicated to the job. He made 10 approaches to the Sorpy Dam before his bomb aimer was satisfied. They flew this sort of suicide march along 60 feet above the dam wall, and they made this approach 10 times before his bomb aimer was convinced that they had it right, and he pressed the toggle and the bomb fell away. And the bomb exploded right beside the dam. It was brilliantly placed. But, as everybody had warned beforehand, the earthen Sorpy was immune to these bouncing bombs, and it didn't break. And because it didn't break, McCarthy got less credit than he deserved. I mean, I think he was, I've said in my book, I think he was an outstandingly brave young man, and to make that approach 10 times, when any one of those approaches, you would have crashed into the hillside. I mean, it was 60 feet you're doing this up. So it was an amazing story. And only one other crew that night made it to the Sorpy, who also dropped pretty close. But again, the second bomb didn't blow it either. But McCarthy was very unusual in that most of the poor kids who flew that raid were killed before the end of the war. Out of 133 who flew the Dams raid, only about 30, I forget the exact number, but only about 30 were still alive at the end of the war. But luckily, Joe McCarthy was one of them. I mean, he'd completed an amazing number of operations for the end of the war, and he went on to fly with the Royal Canadian Air Force all sorts of aircraft types after the war. I mean, he was just a natural flyer, but he's an authentic American war hero who has had less attention than he deserved.
Fascinating. Considering the great amount of effort, training, and resources dedicated to this very actually low probability of success mission, it makes me wonder if Churchill had a number of risky operations in the hopper, so to speak, or did he just have this one that he put all his hopes in?
Churchill did not. Churchill knew nothing about this operation until after it had happened. He was never involved, although in the movie they showed Churchill as having personally authorized the operation. In fact, it was the head of the Air Force, Sir Charles Portal, who pushed the operation ahead. But I've argued in my book that although strategically and materially the operation was not the success that they all hoped for, it made such an impact in moral terms that as military theater, I think it was worth it, only just worth it. But what I have tried to do in my book, in all my books these days, I try to tell the story from the other side. I try just not to look at it in British or American terms. And just as in my Vietnam book, I spent a hell of a lot of time researching the Vietnamese end of the story and writing about the Vietnamese. So in this one, I've written about the great tragedy of what happened in Germany and of all these people who were drowned. It was literally a biblical torrent that descended on them. Millions of tons of water pouring down, shattering all these homes, sweeping away. Whole houses were being torn from the ground and swept away down the valley. The floods extended 100 miles. And the tragedy was they didn't affect any of the major industries of the area, but they did incredible damage. I mean, they wrecked thousands of acres of farmland. If you thought that was worth that, they killed thousands of livestock, cattle and horses, and of course a lot of people. And the stories of these slave laborers, all these women who've been brought from Ukraine and Poland and Russia to work in German factories and German homes. And of course they were trapped behind barbed wire in the compound, and only a small number of them were able to get out of that compound when this floods descended on them, smashed into their huts. And German survivors described this terrible sight of the huts being swept along down the valley with all these screaming women still in them, who couldn't get out, and who were drowned in the wreckage of the huts. I mean, it was a terrible, terrible story. And so while I admire the courage of the kids who flew the bombers enormously, and remember, as usual, most of them were 20, 21, that sort of thing. But I think it's essential at this interval of history that we recognize what it was like for the people who were on the receiving end.
Do you get much into the technical aspects of the operation, the planning, and the technology used, or is it more about the human side?
It's mostly about the human side. Of course, the technical side was amazing because the creation of these bouncing bombs and the fact that they strapped this 3.5-ton rotating bomb, they decided it was going to work better if it was actually dropped while it was rotating. So they put a hydraulic motor on the bottom of the aircraft and they connect it by a driving band to the mine. And 5 minutes before each crew dropped its mine or depth charge or whatever, that they switch on this hydraulic motor. So the thing is rotating at 500 revolutions a minute at the time that it was dropped out of the aircraft. And of course the aircraft vibrating, an extraordinary business to be flying this aircraft at 60 feet, and it had to be exactly 60 feet. And they have 2 searchlights underneath the aircraft, which are set to converge at exactly 60 feet. So you've got the navigator leaning out the side of the plane saying down, 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 down. And the pilot, I remember one of the pilots said afterwards, an Australian called Dave Shannon, he said, you thought the guy was never going to stop saying down, down, down. And eventually there you are flying at 60 feet with this thing revolving under the aircraft. And you've got a crude bomb sight to line up this thing on the towers on the dam. And you're flying straight at it. The Mona was the only one of the dams that was defended. But it's pretty scary when you see the light flak, the 20-millimeter cannon, the 40-millimeter cannon coming straight at you at 60 feet above the deck. And you drop this thing 300-400 yards short of the dam. And the fact that they did it with such amazing precision. And of course, 2 or 3 of them were actually killed trying to do it, because one of them was one of them was actually shot down by flak over the Mona, because of course at 60 feet there's no margin of error. I mean, when he was badly hit, he clawed just enough height for 1 or 2 of the crew to get out, but he went into the deck. And another plane was badly hit. So it was about as scary a mission as you could get, even in the Second World War. And I'm awed by the dedication of the flyers who carried that out. They knew, most of them knew, that the chances of their surviving this mission were not very good, that it was as near to a suicide mission as anything anybody was asked to do in that war. But they didn't hesitate. They really, 2 things that stick in my mind very much, reading their letters of the crews. Duty, which comedians are inclined to mock at that word now, but duty was something that meant a huge amount to them. And so did God, that a good number of them were very devout Christians, and they really cared. They really thought a lot about their Christian duty. And there's a sort of irony, because people who are cynical about these things will say, well, it wasn't very Christian to kill all these, drown all these Germans. But all these kids knew, nobody talked to them about the forced labor camp below the dams. Nobody talked to them about all the civilians who were going to drown. That all they knew was that they were overwhelmingly likely to die, as most of them did before the war was over. And I find it so moving that they took these concepts of both duty and God so seriously.
So I have no doubt of their bravery and skill, but what were their, so I guess the planes were stripped of much of their armor, they removed some of the dorsal guns, or the dorsal gun. What were their private thoughts about maybe the technical aspects of flying with this kind of aircraft?
Well, they had, the Lancaster bomber was probably the outstanding heavy bomber of the Second World War. It was a fantastic aircraft. Obviously much less heavily armored anyway, because it was designed to operate at night. It was much less heavily armored than the Flying Fortress, the American Flying Fortress. And they took out the mid-upper turret to save 1.5 tons of weight, because they got all this kit. They got this bomb hanging underneath the aircraft with a hydraulic motor and so on. One of the things that fascinates me is that the operational research people during the war, working for Bomber Command, concluded that RAF night bombers would do much better to take all the gun turrets out of the aircraft, because they'd save about 3 tons of weight, and they'd fly much faster, and they could fly higher. And the operational research people concluded it was so seldom that RAF gunners flying at night ever shot down a German fighter that they'd be better to forget the defenses and just get on with flying faster and higher. But the chiefs of the RAF wouldn't have that at any price. They said it was psychologically terribly important for the crews to feel they could defend themselves. But of course, with a 303 machine gun, which all RAF aircraft carried in those days, the 303 machine gun, even if it hit a German fighter, had to be a miracle to actually shoot it down, because it just didn't pack much punch compared with American heavier machine guns. So I think the really rough bit, they lost far more planes than they thought. Because they were flying in moonlight, they decided their only chance was to fly all the way to Germany at very low level, not quite 60 feet, but 100 or 200 feet. And that was proved pretty deadly for 2 reasons. One is because normally it was night fighters and not flak that shot down Allied bombers. But in this case, when you were flying so low, that light flak 20 and 40 millimeter German guns, of which there are an awful lot between the North Sea and the Ruhr, were able to have a field day. And secondly, of course, there were all the natural obstacles that 2 of 617 Squadron aircraft on the way to the dam simply flew into power cables that they didn't see. And that was the end of them. And they all had big problems, this flying at very low level. One crew got incredibly lost and never actually found the dams and had to come home without bombing. And Guy Gibson, the squadron leader, who was a brilliant leader but a very tough guy, and the morning after the raid, he sacked that crew that had got lost. They all had, flying all that way up to Germany. But I mean, the thing they couldn't believe, normally they were flying at 20-some thousand feet. Mm-hmm. And at 20-some thousand feet, all you see of Germany is the sort of flames of the cities you're attacking, and searchlights and heavy flak guns firing. But when you're down there at 100 feet, you're seeing all sorts of stuff they never saw. They couldn't believe it. I mean, they're seeing sheep and cattle in the fields and farms and railway lines, and I think crazily, I mean, some of the gunners, they were all so hyped up. When they saw a train, they couldn't resist having a whob at it. Whereas, of course, when you're firing tracer, what that does is it shows the people down on the ground, the bad guys, it shows them the aircraft. So I think they should have ordered them not to fire at all until they got to the dams. But so that whole story of them getting to the dams was an epic in its own right. And it was lethal all the way there and back. I mean, the guy who we all think actually broke the Mona Dam, because it wasn't until the third depth charge or bomb was dropped that the Mona broke. And the guy we think did it, who was a guy who had a nickname of Dingy Young, who was actually half American himself, that his mother came to California, lived in California, and he was married to an American. And Dingy Young, who was a very experienced pilot, and he did brilliantly to break the Mona Dam. But on the way home, he got shot down at the saddest, the most tragic moment of all, because he was just crossing the Dutch coast, literally seconds from safety over the North Sea, when German flak guns got him. And twice before, miraculously, that's why he was known as Dinky, he brought bombers down in the sea, and his crew had been able to get in the dinghy, and after terrible ordeals, they'd eventually been rescued. And so when Young didn't return to their base after the dams raid, everybody laughed and they said, "Oh, Dingy's back on the water again." But this time he wasn't on the water, poor guy. He left a widow over there in New England, who never married again, actually. She devoted the rest of her life to music, a girl called Priscilla. And they'd only, like so many of those wartime marriages, they'd only known each other for a few months.
I'm speaking with Sir Max Hastings, author of Operation Chastise, the RAF's most brilliant attack of World War II, coming out in the U.S. on February 18th, 2020, from Harper Books. You can find his work at maxhastings.com. The link is also in the show notes. And don't forget to like and follow me at warscholar.org and warscholar1945 on YouTube. Now back to our podcast. So you did say you felt the operation was worth it just barely, but considering how high the casualty rate was, and it was some of the best Commonwealth bomber pilots out there, it just strikes me that, like you say, it's just barely worth it, but it's what a price they paid for that.
Yeah, but the saddest thing about the longer I study wars and the more you realize that the operations that are often the bravest and that you lose the best people are very often the ones that don't succeed and don't prove to be worth it. But it's very difficult to quantify anything in a war. It's very difficult when you're not actually capturing territory, and you can't say we captured Rome or we captured Paris or whatever the hell it might be. It's very difficult to quantify things. All you can say in this case was it did make an awful lot of British people feel better. And I say it did a lot for British prestige in the United States, where it had fallen pretty low. There was a terrifying opinion poll a few months earlier that I've got somewhere, and I quoted in another of my books, where Americans were asked who they thought was trying hardest to win the war. And inevitably, a majority of Americans said the United States. But then after that, some said the Russians, and some said the Chinese. But when they were asked where the British came, only 2% of Americans said they thought that the British were trying hardest to win the war, which was a reflection of the fact that Americans had not been impressed by all the defeats the British had suffered earlier in the war. And so there was a lot of cynicism in the United States, and certainly one of the reasons that I would still say that the Dams raid was marginally worthwhile was the fact that it did make such an impression in the United States.
Going back to the technical aspects of the operation, it was interesting to note that the Germans had torpedo netting up. So that
was why they came up with the whole bouncing concept, because you couldn't fire an underwater torpedo at the dam because of the netting in front of the dams. In fact, the Germans had protected almost all their dams, their big dams, with nets, so that you couldn't fire any sort of explosive charge straight at it underwater. So it was only by bouncing it over the water that you had a chance of getting the whole idea was it had to make 3 or 4 bounces, each bomb, rotating as it went. And then it hit the dam wall and then sank. And it sank, and then a hydrostatic pistol fired the charge about 5 or 6 seconds after it sank below the surface. And the degree of precision you needed. I mean, and the other thing, of course, amazing, was it all done in a few weeks. Because although the RAF's chiefs had identified Germany's dams as targets way back in 1938, and they started thinking seriously about them in 1940, it was only in 1942 that, I mean, the trouble was that they knew you needed a big bomb. And British bombers in 1940 and 1941 couldn't possibly carry a bomb big enough to break a German dam. But suddenly, in 1942-43, you've suddenly got the Avro Lancaster, which can suddenly carry a charge that may be big enough to break the dams. And they did all these tests. The tests went on for about 18 months. And they were testing and testing. And eventually they found that if you could explode a charge directly against the dam, then you needed only a relatively small charge, about 3 or 3.5 tons of explosive to maybe break the Mona and the Ada, which they also broke, although that had nothing to do with the rural water system. But the meeting at the Air Ministry, which made the decision to go ahead and to make these bombs and modify the Lancasters, didn't take place till the end of February, and the raid took place in May, March, April, May, 3 months later. So they actually built these bombs and modified the aircraft and trained the crews in the space of 3 months. I mean, it was a fantastic. You think if you started doing something like that in peacetime, it'd probably take you about 3 years to organize and to carry out an operation of that kind. But in those days, under the stresses of war, they put this whole thing together in that short space of time. And of course, the crews, when they were training, they were only told that they were going to have to fly very low at night. So they were practicing over water, over British dams, but they were not told that dams were the target. They were absolutely terrified. It was going to be German battleships, which were incredibly heavily defended. And in fact, when they were finally told on the night of the raid that they were going to attack the German dams, a lot of them were incredibly relieved because they knew nothing at all about dams. They were just so grateful that they weren't being asked to attack the German battleship Tirpitz or one of those, which they did think would be a suicide mission. So when they took off for Germany, yeah, they were scared, but probably not as scared as they would have been if they'd known what it was going to be like.
So it seems that even though the British military didn't seem to be doing its part, didn't have success, it seems like on the technical side of war, the British seem to be well organized to develop the right kind of technologies. Is that the case, or?
The British did very well with their technologies, and when you think of the achievements, not just the bouncing bombs, but the code-breaking technology and a whole lot of other stuff, it wasn't universally successful in that, for example, the Royal Navy was very badly defended against air attack right the way through. But the RAF had some brilliant technology, and later in the war, the British Army got some terrific, very sophisticated tanks of various kinds. That I'd say the British Army was never remotely as effective a fighting machine as the German Army, but the British generally managed to make better war than the Germans in the end. I mean, obviously it had a slow start. The United States had a slow start because it takes a while. If you've been operating in a peacetime environment, it takes a while to tool up your industry for war. But in the end, the British did incredibly well, and the British displayed a lot of ingenuity. And they produced some wonderful weapons, especially aircraft weapons.
Let's turn to the resources you used for your research. You mentioned some older interviews. What else did you use for this book?
Well, what started me out was the fact that when I wrote my earlier book, Bomber Command, back in 1977, that there were a hell of a lot of old aircrew still alive. So I was then able to do a lot of interviews with aircrew. And I did feel that I knew a lot about the bomber offensive and about what it was like to do it. And in fact, the RAF back in those days flew me in its one surviving Lancaster bomber. And I sat in all the old crew positions, and I sat in the rear turret while they had the Spitfire and the Hurricane doing passes over me to show what it looked like to a bomber gunner to have a fighter attacking. And so I felt I got off to a good start, having known a lot from those days. Then I felt that no book had done justice to the German dimension. And I just felt that I wanted to do something about one's admiration for the courage of those kids. A lot of my books, I always try and face the reality, face the truth, and not go in for romantic twaddle about the war. I mean, one has always been terribly aware that most of the kids who did these amazing things, whether American or British, whether by land, sea, or air, whatever they may have said after the war, most of them were absolutely terrified when they did it, and they were right to be terrified. That nobody likes to face the prospect of going to an early grave. And I did I found the whole story of that squadron and those young men so moving. And it's a story with a beginning and a middle and an ending. The Vietnam War book I did took me 3 years research to do. I spent a year traveling in the United States and Vietnam, interviewing and so on. And I'm pretty tired. And when I started the Dambusters book, I was 72. And I felt I wanted to do something that, not a smaller story, because it's a big story, but I wanted to do something within a smaller compass. I didn't want to do another sort of vast blockbuster book. Mm-hmm. And I really enjoyed doing it. And I'm doing another one at the moment about a big Mediterranean naval battle in 1942. And there again, it's a story with a beginning and a middle and an ending about things that happened in a few days. When you get to my stage, having written 27 books, you feel that it's great to be able to do something within a narrower frame. In other words, a miniature rather than the sort of grand widescreen IMAX epic.
You mentioned the letters, I think letters and maybe diaries. Where did you find those? Are those personal effects or in archives?
Well, one of the things, sometimes people say that the historians are not very generous with each other. I've always found I'm amazed how generous a lot of historians are of all nationalities. And I found this with all my books, but especially with this one. There are 2 or 3 writers who devoted their whole lives to studying the Dams raid and studying the Dambuster squadron. And I was so moved by how incredibly generous they were. And the historian of the Dambuster squadron came with me to Germany to visit the dams, and I went round with Germans there who devoted their whole lives to studying it. But also, there was a remarkable man called Richard Morris who wrote a biography of Guy Gibson, the 24-year-old who led the dams raid. And Gibson's story was, in many ways, a tragedy. He was a very unhappy guy, a very lonely guy, very driven. And he was killed in September 44 because really he shouldn't ever have been allowed to return to bomb operations after the dams raid, but he didn't know how to do anything else. He'd been flying bomb operations all his adult life. But anyway, Richard Morris, who wrote his biography, was incredibly generous in giving me a whole mass of stuff that he'd found out about Gibson, some which he found out after he'd completed and published his book. I mean, this poor kid, he'd been born in India, that, as so too was another famous RAF pilot, Douglas Bader, and his mother left his father and came to England when he was 5 or 6 years old to send him to boarding school, which is what happened to all the kids in those days. And back in England, his mother became an alcoholic. And in 1932, while he was still a schoolboy, she served a prison sentence for driving offences, having injured pedestrians while drunk. And Christmas Eve 1939, that while drunk, she, in the very first months of the war, that she caught her dress in an electric fire, and the dress caught fire, and she burnt to death, a horrible lingering death. It's not surprising when you know all that about this guy, Gibson, who was then about 20 when all this happened. It's not surprising. He was an incredibly driven young man. He had innumerable girlfriends. He married a much older showgirl with whom he was thoroughly unhappy. The only thing he really loved was he had a Labrador that he adored, that was killed the night before the dams raid. And I think he loved that dog more than he loved any human being. After the dams raid, when everybody else was celebrating, and he was awarded the Victoria Cross, our equivalent of the U.S. Medal of Honor, that whenever Gibson got drunk, he would always talk more about the tragedy of his dog being dead than about his broken up marriage or his girlfriends or anything else. That the loss of that dog was a terrible blow to him. And he went to America, and he became rather a star in America. He went round giving speeches which everybody loved and lots of interviews, and he had a great time, and again went to bed with a lot of girls. But when he came back to England early in 44, all he could think of to do was just to go back to bombing. And I say he was killed in September 1944, but his tragic life is an amazing story in its own right, albeit a very sad one.
Yeah. Was there, so in the research for this newest book, did you find anything that surprised you?
I'm not sure it surprised me, because you've got to remember I've been living with the Second World War and these stories most of my adult life. I've been writing books about it. But I think I didn't know the scale. First of all, I was amazed by how quickly they put the whole thing together from that decision at the end of February 43 down to the raid 3 months later. And secondly, the more you study these kids, and they were kids, I keep using the word kids, but they were, apart from being very sophisticated about how to fly an airplane and how to bomb Germany, they really knew nothing about anything. They were fantastically naive, and of course most of them never had a chance to complete a life, to get married, to have kids, to have any sort of proper life at all. And of course they all wrote a lot of letters, because in those days you didn't have a lot of access to the telephone, and you were only allowed a 3-minute conversation, even if you did get on telephone. So they all wrote letters. A lot of these young men, who were all going to be branded as heroes, whether dead or alive, the letters they wrote that survive, and I say are very moving, most of them were not to wives or girlfriends, because they didn't have them. They were dear mummy. That it was their mothers who were still the big thing in their lives. And there's a Scottish estate up. I go up to Scotland to fish and hunt in the summer, and I drive past an estate that used to belong to the family of one of the Dambusters, and I think of him every time I go by. He was 21 years old when he was killed, and he'd been a big star at school, and he'd been a rowing star and an athlete, and he'd done everything. And then he died after bombing the Ada Dam, age 21, and the pathos of it all, he was one of those who wrote letters, dear mummy, and the pathos of it all, it's a great story. I mean, it's a different story from the movie, because everybody, you mentioned Churchill earlier on, because an awful lot of people, even in the United States, have seen the Dambusters movie, and everybody thinks it was because Churchill was the one who authorized the raid, and he wasn't. So I did want to tell the story straight, because the story told straight, even without all the bits the movie put in, is an absolutely astounding story of scientific endeavor and human endeavor. And I still find, I went up while I was writing this book, I went up to do a photo shoot for the Times newspaper up at what they call the Battle of Britain flight, the RAF, where they keep their veteran aircraft. And I found, although I didn't fly this time in the Lancaster, because I'm 6'5" tall, inside the aircraft, I have a hell of a time climbing over the main spar or getting into the turrets, because as you get older, you get even clumsier and clumsier. But I found I still have a tear in my eye when I look at that Lancaster, because of what it means, in the same way that many Americans have a tear in their eye when they look at a flying fortress, because you just know what those generations did. And it reminds one of how fantastically privileged we are, our generation. We've sure, some guys have fought in Vietnam or fought in some of Britain's wars and so on, but generally speaking, we've been spared wars in our own homeland, and we've been spared, thank goodness, being asked to do any of the sort of stuff that those guys were asked to do. And when people sometimes complain now and they worry about the problems facing the world, and sure, there's plenty to worry about, starting with climate change. But nonetheless, we have been phenomenally privileged. And every time I write stories about that era, it just reminds me just how privileged we are.
I agree. I was kind of surprised, maybe I shouldn't have been, that the squadron was kept together, that it went beyond just this mission. It just seemed interesting that it remained as a squadron with new people and that sort of thing.
Well, they realized, the leaders of the RAF, even those like Harris, who've been deeply skeptical about bombing the dams, they realized that there was something to be said. Most of Bomber Command had trouble finding a given city on a given night, never mind precision bombing. So if you had a squadron that was committed to attacking precision targets, Harris saw a purpose in keeping it together. But I have to say, I'm a cynic about this. I don't think they ever found a target really worthy of the Dambuster squadron again. But, for example, they did a lot of bombing in 44, 617 Squadron, of the German B-weapon sites in France and Holland. But actually, they weren't very successful in knocking them out. And it's a grim statistic that at the end of the war, it turned out that the RAF and United States Air Force had killed more French and Dutch people trying to bomb the German B-weapon sites than the Germans had killed in Britain with their firing their flying bombs and their rockets. And the other great precision bombing feat of 617 Squadron was the sinking of the Tirpitz, the battleship Tirpitz, in a Norwegian field from in November 1944. But the trouble is, and this is where I become, where I steer away from the romantic vision of war. If it had been possible to sink the Tirpitz in 1940, 41, 42, even 43, it would have been a great strategic achievement. By November 1944, and the RAF and the Royal Navy had made repeated efforts, unsuccessful efforts, to attack the Tirpitz. By that date, that it didn't mean much because the Germany was obviously on its knees, and the German Navy was almost out of the war except for the U-boats. And so sinking the Tirpitz, it was a brilliant circus trick, but it had no strategic significance. So although they did some terrific attacks, they knocked out a couple of the 617 Squadron precision bombing, knocked out a few viaducts and this sort of thing. I would say they never achieved anything comparable with what they achieved with that first raid in May 1943 when they destroyed those two dams, which, whether or not it had the strategic effect they hoped for, it was one hell of an achievement of precision bombing.
Mm-hmm. So with this book, both for people who are maybe familiar with the operation or those who are not, what do you hope the book will do?
I hope it'll make people see it again in a new perspective. An awful lot of people have seen the movie. This is, I hope, the true story of the movie. One always wants to be very careful about, I often tell people, whenever you see on a book jacket the words definitive, throw it straight in the dustbin, because there ain't no such thing. All any of us can do is do our take on a given event. But one thing that's pleased me terrifically with the British readership, and we have had a big bestseller over here, is that a lot of people have emailed me and written to me and said, you told us a load of stuff about the Dambusters raid that we never knew. And I'd like to think that I've had a pretty good shot of, on the one hand, telling a great, it was romantic story, and on the other hand, bringing home a lot of harsh, very tough realities about the limitations of what it achieved and about the terrible things it did in Germany. And what I'm always trying to do with all my books, I'm not a debunker, that the truth about almost everything lies somewhere in the middle about everything, whether it's in war or peace. So I'm just trying to strip away a lot of historic myths and a lot of romantic legends and just say, well, here more or less was based on facts that we know. It is the best telling of this that I can come up with in the year of our Lord 2019, 2020 as it is now in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Any difficulties in getting the book finished?
Getting it finished.
Was it a smooth process?
I don't know. I've been doing this a long time. It was a story I really wanted to write. Mm-hmm. I find it very exciting telling a story that I want to tell. The hard part is the research. That there were moments when I was writing the Vietnam book, and there were moments, I remember there was a moment in a rainstorm in North Carolina where I was driving around in a Avis car trying to find a motel where I was going to interview a couple of veterans. And I thought, my God, I'm getting too old to do this. And I didn't have that sort of moment with this story because I was sure I knew where to find the material, and I was sure I got a great story to tell. And so once I was actually writing the story while I was really motoring, and in fact I'm about to go off to a beach house in Malaysia and start writing the story of this big naval battle in 42. And again, I feel that sense of excitement. I'm not frightened about doing it because I know I've got a mass of very good material, British and Italian and American and German. And what's really exciting as a writer is when you think I know I've got the story. All I got to do now is just tell it. And really, in the end, what we all are, whether we call ourselves historians or writers or journalists or whatever it may be, we're storytellers. And if we have successes and if we become bestsellers, then the only way we can do that is if we can spin a yarn, if we can tell a story that a lot of people out there want to read.
Mm-hmm. Where can people find your work on the web?
Well, I've got my own website, which tells you most of the stuff you're going to want to know, maxhastings.com. Mm-hmm. And I get a lot of American visitors to that website. So you'll find a lot of stuff about me and about the book there. And pretty soon, I hope you'll all be writing to me from the United States about Operation Chastise, because I hope that you guys, although there were only a handful of Americans involved in the story, that it's such a remarkable story that it sort of crosses national boundaries, that it shouldn't really matter what nationality people you're writing about. It's just a great, great, great yarn.
Mm-hmm. That's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
No, that's fine, Chris. And thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. You can find more podcasts like this on your favorite podcast feed under the title Military History Inside Out. That includes Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. One great way to support me is to rate my podcasts, either good or bad. You can find more great military history information at warscholar.org, on YouTube at Warscholar 1945, on Facebook at Warscholar, on Instagram at Chris Alvarez Warscholar, and on Twitter at Warscholar. Please support me by following me on those sites and liking my videos. If you like to read, don't forget to sign up for my weekly newsletter where I recommend newly published books. The subscription box is on my webpage. Thank you.